Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 26, The King and the Pope. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, tensions had deteriorated between the Pope and the Emperor. Ravenna remained under imperial control, but the exarch was unable to impose his authority outside of Ravenna. Tired of defiant popes, Emperor Leo claimed the diocese of East Illyricum in 733. This massive region included the Balkans, Greece, Crete, Sicily, and southern Italy, and had been assigned to the western half of the Roman Empire when the empire was divided by Diocletian in 286. The administrative division made sense since these regions largely spoke Greek and were linked economically to Constantinople. However, Pope Gregory and his successors resented the loss of authority over regions near Rome, especially southern Italy and the Balkans. Since Rome and Ravenna no longer supported each other, Liutprand, king of the Lombards, saw an opportunity to expand his influence in southern Italy. Liutprand proved unwilling to actually attack Rome, but it had become clear that Constantinople was unable to protect Rome against the Lombards. Increasingly vulnerable, the papacy worked hard to build a relationship with the Franks to counterbalance the threat of the Lombards. It now seems obvious that Pippin would agree to support Pope Stephen against the Lombards, but Pippin wanted to extend Frankish control over nearby Aquitaine, Brittany, Saxony, Alemannia, and Bavaria. That was a long to-do list, so he did not have much free time. Had Pippin already put himself in Zacharias' debt when he asked for the Pope's approval to dethrone Childeric III? Maybe. But it is unlikely that he would have considered the defeat of the Lombards a fair payment of that debt. A generous donation to a few churches seems more appropriate. Realizing that the situation was too important to be handled by envoys, Stephen traveled to Frankia to lobby Pippin in person. This decision was more important than it seems. Popes rarely traveled, and a trip to Gaul in the days of poor roads was no light undertaking, which shows his desperation. The trip took nearly 2 months, but he finally reached the royal palace on January 6, 754. Aware that he already had a large kingdom to administer, Pippin first negotiated with Aistulf. However, the Lombard king made a mistake when he asked Charlemagne to leave the monastery at Monte Cassino in central Italy to be his representative. Pippin simply arrested his brother and threw him in a monastery, a more remote monastery. The arrest of the chief negotiator did not help negotiations. While Pippin had felt sufficiently secure to imprison Charlemagne, an extensive campaign with a lengthy absence was much more serious, so he wisely made sure that he had enough support. As a result, Pippin spent the winter persuading his lords to back his planned campaign in Italy. The hard work paid off when the Frankish lords assembled at Chieri in April and agreed to assist the Pope. Stephen and his successors later claimed that Pippin had agreed to expand the territory of the Republic of St. Peter. A document listing the Pope's territorial claims had been produced at the assembly, but it has been lost. The only reason we know what Stephen expected is that his successor, Hadrian, claimed that Pippin had promised to restore all of Italy, including Spoleto, Benevento, Venice, and Ravenna, to the Papal Republic. Honestly, these claims are hard to take seriously. Stephen should have been grateful that Pippin agreed to invade northern Italy to protect Rome and Stephen's exalted position. It is extremely unlikely that Pippin promised this or even had the resources to accomplish such a massive conquest. Even if he was willing to basically conquer most of Italy, why would he then hand over those territories to the Pope? In exchange for the decision to invade Lombardy, Stephen crowned Pippin king. I know, he was already king, but the basis for his crowning had been pretty flimsy, so the ceremony was worthwhile. Pippin delivered on his promise in 755 when the Franks defeated the Lombards and marched towards Pavia. Hoping to avoid a siege, King Aistulf promised to return Ravenna and to stay out of papal lands in the future. In addition, the Lombard king handed over treasure, which covered the cost of the expedition. Pippin might have been willing to do the Pope a favor in exchange for a formal coronation, but his lords had to pay and feed their men, which was not cheap. It is worth pointing out that after he had been defeated, Aistulf negotiated with Pippin, not Stephen. Still, the cities taken from the Duchy of Rome were returned to the Pope, and Ravenna was handed over as well. But the final treaty at Pavia did not mention Venice, Spoleto, or Benevento. Basically, the treaty restored the status quo. While Stephen was undoubtedly pleased that a dangerous neighbor had been humbled, Aistulf had noticed that Pippin had not brought a large army with him, and he likely knew from his contacts in the Frankish kingdom that Pippin's nobles, and likely Pippin himself, had little enthusiasm for a lengthy campaign in Italy. Pippin left Italy in the summer of 755, and Aistulf started his siege of Rome on January 1st, 756. So he had clearly waited until Pippin was safely back in Frankia. Aistulf had gambled that Pippin was unwilling to risk 2 campaigns in Italy, but he soon discovered that he was wrong. Pippin returned and forced Aistulf to hand over the promised cities. It is worth taking a moment to consider what would have happened if Pippin had not intervened decisively the second time. The Pope had no other options. Constantinople was too weak to send any serious aid, and the Duchy of Rome was unable to defend itself. Aistulf would probably not have sacked Rome, he just would have expanded his territory deep into Ravenna and the Duchy of Rome. At the same time, it is equally unlikely that Aistulf could have expanded his rule over all of Italy. He simply lacked the resources. Before I discuss the effect of the defeats on the Lombards, I will briefly talk about the Republic of St. Peter. Although previous popes had described Rome as a republic, there is no official date for the start of the republic. However, once Aistulf had been defeated, Stephen began to use the term Roman Republic or Republic of the Romans to describe the papal lands, basically Rome and several nearby towns. Admittedly, Stephen himself had not made a final decision on the correct term, but it is fair to conclude that the papacy began to view itself as a republic after 756. Anyway, back to the Lombards. Aistulf had been disciplined twice by Pippin. Shortly after Pippin returned home the second time, Aistulf was killed in a hunting accident. Had he been assassinated by angry nobles? Honestly, we have no idea, but the timing is suspicious. So, who would succeed Aistulf? Ratchis, Aistulf's predecessor, was in the monastery at Monte Cassino, but he immediately left the monastery, either to be regent or to try to be king again. Since Aistulf did not have an heir, it seems likely that Ratchis intended to rule. However, Ratchis had been an erratic king before entering a monastery, so many Lombards may have felt that it was time for someone new. Desiderius, a duke in Tuscany, felt that he deserved to be king, or at least wanted to be king. Some Lombard nobles agreed, but not enough. Since Desiderius had been Aistulf's former constable, the supporters of Ratchis may have feared that he would continue Aistulf's aggressive policies that had resulted in repeated humiliations by Pippin. Needing someone with enough influence to win over his rival's supporters, Desiderius approached Pope Stephen, strange as it may sound. Actually, the Pope was happy to endorse Desiderius for a small processing fee, basically a promise to live in peace with the Papal Republic. Also, all of the towns in northern and central Italy taken by the Lombards. In exchange, Stephen offered legitimacy, troops, and most important, he persuaded Ratchis to return to the monastery. Given the distance, Pippin was not actively involved in the negotiations, but he certainly did not oppose Desiderius. While the papal support helped to prevent a bloody Lombard civil war, the papacy did not benefit as much as expected. Unwilling to let either the Lombards or the empire have Ravenna, Pippin had donated it, along with several other cities and castles, to the papacy in what became known as the Donation of Pippin. However, Pippin does not seem to have consulted with the leaders of Ravenna, who asked King Desiderius to help evict the Roman force sent by the Pope to occupy the city. Honestly, this seems ungrateful of Desiderius, since the Pope had just helped him become king. Maybe he believed strongly that the citizens of Ravenna should be allowed to choose their ruler, or he did not want the Pope to become too powerful. Despite Pippin's 2 campaigns against the Lombards, he clearly had no interest in a third. When Desiderius gained control of the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento, Pippin does not seem to have cared, ignoring several letters from Paul, who had succeeded his brother Stephen as Pope in April 757. Actually, Pippin seems to have completely lost interest in Italy. Instead, he focused on Aquitaine, which was easier to reach and apparently more important to him since he invaded nearly every year from 759 to 768. Basically, he was no longer satisfied with nominal control over the duchy as long as the Duke pretended to submit. Duke Hunald had entered a monastery in 745 and had been succeeded by his son Wifer. Why was Pippin suddenly interested in Aquitaine? The key factor was likely competition over the city of Narbonne, since Wifer had attacked Pippin's men when they laid siege to the city in 759. Narbonne had been controlled by Muslims since they had captured it in 719, but Pippin felt strong enough to take it from the Caliphate. Why was the Caliphate unable to defend Narbonne, you ask? This is a good opportunity to catch up with the situation in al-Andalus. As I explained earlier, the arrival of Syrian troops who had survived a massive defeat by Berbers in North Africa had led to a civil war between the established Arab settlers and the new arrivals who were from different tribes. Yusuf ibn Abd al-Rahman al-Fidi, the governor of Narbonne, had helped to end the civil war and then became governor of al-Andalus. At first, he was only supposed to serve for a few years, but he had become comfortable ruling. Other regional leaders disagreed with his decision, which led to a series of revolts in 750. Since Yusuf al-Fidi had been based in Narbonne, he used much of the Berber garrison in his struggle with the rebels. Fortunately, there was no clear leader to unite his opponents, until a leader basically arrived in al-Andalus as a byproduct of a change in dynasty at the Caliphate. This change in dynasty was due to discontent within the Caliphate, which should not be a surprise since it had expanded incredibly quickly, absorbing different ethnic groups and traditions without building a balanced system to represent those groups. If the ruling Umayyad family had been stable, a new governing system might have evolved, but the family was not stable and there were 6 separate caliphs in the 740s. The Abbasid dynasty soon declared itself the ruling clan and defeated the Umayyads in 750, followed by the relentless extermination of the Umayyad clan. That extermination process was almost entirely successful. The most notable surviving Umayyad was Abd al-Rahman, who basically fled as far from the Abbasids as possible. Displaying remarkable initiative and a strong network of supporters, the last Umayyad prince somehow eluded bounty hunters for 5 years as he slowly made his way west before he finally reached al-Andalus. He had good timing. There was a destructive civil war going on, so a new leader who was not connected to the opposing factions was ideal. Abd al-Rahman arrived on the peninsula in the fall of 755. The rest of the fall and the winter were spent contacting local leaders until he was able to recruit an army, which defeated al-Fidi. On May 14, 756, he was proclaimed Emir of Cordoba, and it became clear that he intended to become an independent ruler, not a governor. Despite the victory, the new emir was busy strengthening his control over the peninsula, so Abd al-Rahman was unable to support Narbonne against a Frankish siege, and the city surrendered in 759. As a result, Pippin would be able to focus on Aquitaine without fear of a Muslim army suddenly appearing from the south. There is no debate that Pippin focused his attention on Aquitaine, since he would target a fortress each year. The campaigns were brutal since Pippin used his wealth to build complex siege machinery to capture fortified towns, and he would spend the winters in Aquitaine to avoid travel delays. Once a fortress had been captured, the walls would be left unrepaired or even destroyed for building materials. The Franks did not build fortresses within the kingdom, placing them only on the frontiers. Waifar responded by retreating south, but Pippin was relentless, and Waifar was assassinated by his own men in 768. The scale of the campaigns required huge numbers of men, so Pippin brought lords from all over the kingdom to join the campaigns, but not all were enthusiastic. In particular, Tassilo of Bavaria was clearly fed up with being treated like a vassal, since he tired of a campaign in Aquitaine and left for home in 763. Given the vast distance between Bavaria and Aquitaine, Tassilo likely felt that he would not benefit from a land grab in Aquitaine. Anyway, he probably wanted to focus on his own land grab. Bavaria had been expanding eastwards since Odilo, Tassilo's father, had defeated the Avars and then gained control over the Slav Carinthians, which was followed by efforts to colonize the region and convert the Slavs. Still, aside from the irritating autonomy of Bavaria, this relentless focus confirmed that Pippin had a solid grasp on his kingdom. In particular, he had reclaimed control of the minting of coinage, which had been gradually taken over by various abbots, bishops, and counts, who had produced coins of varying quality. Most important, those coins rarely included the king's name. In 755, Pippin laid down a specific requirement for the amount of coins produced from a pound of silver and ensured that the coins always had his name. Aside from making himself king, Pippin had confirmed his father's work and greatly expanded the kingdom, adding Aquitaine to the increasingly long list of Frankish territories. To sum up, Pippin agreed to support Pope Stephen against the Lombards, and King Aistulf was forced to return territory to Rome, which had become a papal republic. However, Pippin proved to lack interest in helping the Pope expand into Ravenna. Once the papacy had been made secure against aggressive neighbors, Pippin decided that it was time to regain control of Aquitaine. The duchy was determined to remain autonomous, but Pippin was relentless and campaigned there year after year for most of a decade. Resistance finally ended when the duke was killed by his own men. Ordinarily, the Muslims of al-Andalus would have taken advantage of the situation to expand into the region, but they were preoccupied with the civil war. Finally, Abd al-Rahman established a new emirate, but he was busy strengthening his control over the peninsula, so Pippin had a free hand in Aquitaine. Pippin had greatly expanded the Frankish kingdom, but he had two sons. Could they agree to share the kingdom when he died? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.